face turns toward the African sun. It is roughly 300,000 years ago. The person looking up belongs to the earliest chapters of Homo sapiens. We cannot see the color of their skin. Skin did not survive with the bones. But genetics, ultraviolet biology, and the African origin of our species all point in the same direction. Early Homo sapiens were probably strongly pigmented. That makes every face around you part of a mystery. If our species began in Africa with darkly pigmented skin, how did humans develop the full spectrum of skin tones we see today? The answer is stranger than a simple journey from dark to light. 7,000 years ago, one hunter-gatherer in Spain carried a combination that scrambles modern categories: dark skin and blue eyes. Farther east, other populations evolved lighter pigmentation using partly different genetic instructions. One origin, similar pressures, more than one solution. And the story begins inside a cell smaller than the point of a needle. In 2010, anthropologist Nina Jablonski and geographer George Chaplin placed maps of ancestral skin pigmentation beside maps of ultraviolet radiation. The match was hard to miss. Where ultraviolet radiation stayed intense, populations tended to be darker. Where it was weaker, they tended to be lighter. But skin color is not created by simply adding more pigment cells. Your skin contains cells called melanocytes. They manufacture melanin, package it into tiny structures called melanosomes, and pass those packages into neighboring skin cells. Compare the same patch of the body, and people with light and dark skin have broadly similar numbers of melanocytes. Think of them as pigment factories. The number of factories is broadly similar, but what changes is how much they produce, how the pigment is packaged, and how those packages are distributed. More melanin can absorb and dissipate more ultraviolet radiation before it reaches vulnerable tissue. It is protection, although not perfect protection. So if that shield worked so well, why would evolution ever reduce it? Because protection was only half the problem. The same sunlight threatened one essential molecule and helped create another. In 1978, physicians Richard Branda and John Eaton exposed human plasma to simulated strong sunlight. Within 60 minutes, 30 to 50% of its folate had been lost. Under those laboratory conditions, as much as half was gone in the length of a lunch break. But give that number a warning label. Plasma in a laboratory is not an ancestral human body, and the experiment did not prove the entire history of skin color evolution. It offered a clue. Folate helps cells copy DNA. It matters during fetal development, and severe deficiency can damage fertility and reproduction. Those are exactly the kinds of consequences natural selection can act on long before old age. Highly pigmented skin could help protect folate and living tissue under intense ultraviolet radiation. But sunlight has another biological role. Ultraviolet B begins the chemical process that allows skin to produce vitamin D. The shield was useful. It also filtered part of the signal. Under the intense ultraviolet radiation of Africa, that trade made sense. Then some human populations carried the same pigment system beneath a different sky. Humans left Africa more than once. But genomic evidence places the major dispersal ancestral to many people living outside Africa, roughly 50 to 70,000 years ago. Their descendants entered worlds with different seasons, diets, clothing, and intensities of ultraviolet B. In some of those environments, the ultraviolet threat had weakened while the need to make enough vitamin D remained. Variants that let more ultraviolet B reach the vitamin D pathway could become useful. Across many generations, variants associated with lighter pigmentation could spread when they improved reproductive success under those conditions. But this was never a machine that converted latitude directly into color. Vitamin D can also come from food. Clothing changes exposure. Migration and intermarriage move genes. Chance decides which useful mutations are available in a population. Ultraviolet radiation helped set the problem. History changed the possible answers. And if the rule were simply north equals light, the first people in Europe should have looked like modern Northern Europeans. They did not. Then, in 2014, ancient DNA put a face to the problem. Inigo Olalde and an international team recovered the genome of a Mesolithic hunter-gatherer known as Labranja 1. He had lived in what is now Spain around 7,000 years ago. His DNA carried ancestral pigmentation variants consistent with dark skin. It also carried variants associated with blue eyes. This was one individual, not proof that every ancient European looked the same, but he broke a familiar assumption. Skin color, eye color, and hair color did not travel through history as one fixed package. Different traits changed on different timelines. Then the evidence widened from 1 man to 230 ancient genomes. A study led by geneticist Mathieson examined West Eurasians who lived between 6500 and 300 BC. Their DNA revealed selection at pigmentation-related regions, while populations were also moving and mixing across Europe. Farming did not simply turn Europeans light. Natural selection, migration, and admixture changed the frequencies of pigmentation variants over thousands of years. But Europe was only one version of the experiment. Farther east, evolution reached a similar visible result without copying the same complete set of instructions. In 2007, anthropologist Heather Norton and her colleagues tested whether lighter pigmentation in Europeans and East Asians came from one shared genetic solution. If it had evolved once in their common Eurasian ancestors, the most important variants should have appeared in both populations. Instead, several genes that played major roles in European light pigmentation did not play the same roles in East Asia. The two populations had not followed completely separate routes, and some components were shared, but much of the genetic road diverged. Then the genetic map grew more complicated. In 2024, a study of nearly 50,000 East Asian participants identified 23 regions associated with skin color traits, including 11 that had not been reported before. Evolution had faced a similar problem in Western and Eastern Eurasia and assembled partly different answers. Biologists call this convergent evolution, similar outcomes reached by different routes. The destination looked alike, the genetic road did not. And once the same visible result can be built more than one way, the idea of three clean human color boxes begins to fall apart. Africa alone contains enormous pigmentation diversity. In 2017, Nicholas Crawford and his colleagues measured skin pigmentation in more than 1,500 people from ethnically diverse African populations. They found important variants near several different pigmentation genes with alleles associated with both lighter and darker skin. A 2024 study then screened more than 1,000 candidate variants and uncovered still more regulatory routes affecting melanin production within African populations. There was never one uniform African shade that simply became lighter as people walked north. There were changing populations, many genes, repeated migrations, and overlapping ranges of pigmentation. So, if ultraviolet radiation matters so much, why do people whose ancestors lived at similar latitudes not all look alike? Because a selective pressure is not a paint code. Ultraviolet conditions help define the problem. Diet, clothing, culture, migration, admixture, genetic drift, and the mutations available to each population influence the solution. Natural selection can only work with the variation history gives it. So skin pigmentation is not random. But it is not arranged into a few natural boxes either. It is a continuous, polygenic trait shaped by environment and population history. The categories look sharp on a form because humans drew sharp lines. The biology underneath does not obey them. Now look in a mirror. The skin looking back at you contains part of this history. It is not a perfect ancestry map. Migration and mixture have folded many histories together, but it still carries traces of how some of your ancestors lived with ultraviolet radiation. But the world now moves faster than that history. A person can cross from the equator to a northern winter in hours. Natural selection works across generations. Our bodies can enter a new ultraviolet environment before our luggage arrives, but our inherited pigmentation came from journeys far older than airports. Return to that face under the African sun 300,000 years ago. That person did not belong to any modern racial box. Their world had no words for the categories later societies would invent. What they did carry was the same basic pigment machinery inside you now: melanocytes manufacturing melanin, cells receiving it, and genes adjusting the system across generations. Every modern skin tone is a variation produced from that shared machinery. Not a ladder, not a ranking, not a border between separate kinds of people. Your skin tone is not a border. It is one inherited answer to an ancient environment, written in a biological language every human shares.